We thought you'd be on the road at 6:30 heading home, so we decided to play this one right now. In an exclusive conversation with CNBC, RBI Governor Raghuram Rajan has picked a fight on behalf of all emerging markets. He's taking on, well, mostly the Fed. He says all central banks, not just the Fed, have to recognize that their monetary policies have spillover effects. India, he says, is prepared to absorb measured tapering by the Fed. The governor has also added in that interview that India's current account deficit is under control, and we now need to see a pickup in growth. The rupee, he says, is stable, and foreign investors will take future bets on the rupee if they see inflation coming down. Listen in to this exclusive interview that touches upon all of these issues starting now.
Well, first, I think the comments were made in the context of what I worry about in the longer run, that we're seeing waves of capital flows, first to the emerging markets, then to the industrial countries, back to the emerging markets, and this time back to the industrial countries. And I worry that this is creating instability in the global economy, and we're not paying enough attention to this. And in the shorter run context, it was that now that the industrial countries were getting back into a more healthy growth situation, there's a sense that, oh, you emerging markets are on your own, figure out what you have to do, each one on its own bottom, which I know is not the message that is intended or that was intended by the monetary policy actions of central banks, including the Fed, but that was the message that was coming across and the markets were taking. So it was an attempt to say, look, we all need to be in it together. And yes, we have a number of things that we emerging markets have to do, and we will do them, and we have done them. But there are responsibilities on the side of the industrial countries also to make this a good recovery. And now that you're recovering, you can't say, look, you're on your own, or at least send the unintended message that that's the case.
What would you have Janet Yellen do?
I would think that all central banks, not just the Fed, have to recognize that their monetary policies have spillover effects that are have over the last few years led, the extremely easy monetary policy has led to a buildup of capital flows into emerging markets and a lot more leverage than emerging markets have typically been used to. Now the reversal has to be handled carefully, because that deleveraging can create the same kind of destruction that happened with the deleveraging in the industrial countries. So you have to be measured. Now, I think tapering has to happen. There has to be exit, but there has to be a cognizance that, you know, these things affect the emerging markets also. So a sensitivity, I think that's the right word to use, a sensitivity to the situation in emerging markets, alter the paces of tapering based on conditions there also, not exclusively, not even largely, but be sensitive to that as you move forward.
So where's the balance? What should tapering look like? What should the speed of tapering look like right now, given the global economic situation today?
I would not alter the pace of tapering. I think 10 billion that was done in the last two Fed meetings is fine. What I would say is, in situations where there is a lot of turmoil in the emerging markets, language that pays attention to it and the willingness, you know, there's a lot of forward guidance that industrial country central banks give on what happens if their domestic situation changes. Some sensitivity to what happens if the international situation changes dramatically would be useful. We don't know what will happen in the world. We have problems today in Ukraine. We had problems in Argentina a few weeks ago. So some sensitivity, and certainly not the language that says, look, you guys are on your own, we're going to do what we have to do, and you pick up the pieces. That language is not helpful. And I think there is a realization amongst many participants in the meeting that we have to be careful.
So given the friction that we're hearing about at the G20 between the industrialized nations and the emerging nations, what sort of tone do your conversations with Janet Yellen take?
Janet and I know each other, no, I mean, I respect her greatly. She's a very experienced, very prepared central banker. And I don't think we're talking about, something that she doesn't already know. I think we're talking about how we should collectively sort of address these issues and communicate with markets.
You were telling me earlier that there is some difference between the comments that you make and the way that that's played out in international media. How would you then categorise the comments that have been made by some of the attendees here? For example, George Osborne, who essentially said that some emerging markets are blaming the Fed taper for problems of their own that they should fix.
So I don't know what context he made those comments. At least from my perspective, I wasn't making the comments because India was particularly affected by the latest bout of tapering. India has been relatively stable since September. The currency has been very, very stable. We've brought down the current account deficit from 5% to 1.5% through some dramatic moves over the last few months. Inflation is coming down. The fiscal deficit has come down and is sticking to the fiscal consolidation path. We've done all that we were supposed to do, except we want to see more growth. We're at 5%. We'd like to see more growth. But what we were trying to say is this is not about us. This is about changing a world where we have these gales of capital going back and forth and leaving destruction in their wake. If you don't want to repeat once more, which is emerging markets start building reserves once again, because the message that has gone out is you're all on your own. Nobody's going to come to your help if you run a large current account deficit. Build your reserves, shrink your current account deficit, have a very competitive exchange rate. If that's the message that goes out, we're setting in place the roots of the next crisis, which is capital flowing back to the industrial countries, world demand being lower than it should be because the emerging markets are not spending as much as they should, and you set in place the conditions for the global savings glut.
Back in 2011, you were talking about the formation of an international monetary policy committee. Could this be part of the answer?
Well, I think the first part is to recognize that there are these spillover effects and to then start taking that into account when we set monetary policy. Not so much you're setting monetary policy for the rest of the world when you're the United States or the United Kingdom, but you recognize that there are feedback effects and you're sensitive to them. So the first I would say is sensitivity. In the longer run, recognizing that we are a fully integrated world, that capital transmits monetary policy instantaneously across the world, larger central banks have to model what goes on in the rest of the world and be sensitive to that, because yes, it does feed back, but sometimes the effects are more than the feedback effects. What hits back to the United States or hits back to Japan or hits back to the United Kingdom may be a fraction of what actually happens out there. And so we need over time to discuss a broader view of monetary policy rather than just narrowly focused. Now, it's difficult. I have no doubt that setting monetary policy for your own country is difficult. Taking into account feedback effects elsewhere is going to be an order of difficulty that is greater. But the fact that it's difficult doesn't, say that we oughtn't try to do it, because it does have these effects. So we have to work. I think we already have discussions we meet each other at the Basel, at the BIS. But the problem so far is each country has its own mandate, and that mandate precludes looking outside. You will set monetary policy to maximize employment and get price stability in your own country. But with an integrated world, this is too narrow. We have to be broader than this. And again, I emphasize it's because in the short run, it may not matter as much, but these crises that we've had are not unrelated to the policies that we've been following, both in emerging markets as well as in industrial countries.
What sort of pushback are you getting on the messages that you're putting forward to the G20, or are you getting agreement?
No. Well, obviously, it's more it's different from what people have been saying, but others have been saying this. Jaime Caruana, the general manager of the BIS, has been talking in this vein for some time, and certainly the BIS has been very forceful in pushing the idea that there are these cross-border spillovers which we need to take into account. And remember, they have credibility because they were arguing that this was important before the financial crisis and saying that this would lead to it. So I think we have to have a continuous discussion. I think first recognizing the issue is the starting point. And my remarks were intended to push for recognition of the issue, that your actions have effects elsewhere. And, you know, I know you recognize it, but we need to talk about it more openly and be sensitive to these effects. And then over time, I think we will, at some point, you know, maybe 10 years from now, get the recognition in Congress, in the Indian Parliament, elsewhere, that monetary policy has to have a broader remit than the domestic economy.
One of the Australian Treasurer Joe Hockey's key objectives at the G20 was to put a number in terms of global growth targets. Is this the right thing to do?
There is a real concern that the G20 process is meandering a little bit, and I think my concern is that we should talk about some of the areas of friction, because that's where we can get some clarity and we can make some improvements in the way we behave. But there are also areas where each one of us can do better learning from each other. And growth is one of those areas. I mean, no country is deliberately holding back on growth. We're trying to work as hard as we can to improve growth. The question is there some learning to be had, for example, from how Australia has improved productivity through the Productivity Commission, what changes it has made on labor laws, for example. Can France learn something from that? Can India learn something? So these kinds of discussions, if we can focus on some of the experiences that countries have had, and I think that's the Australian intent, it will help us sort of learn from each other and push growth further. Now, I do think that many of us are doing what we can on growth, and being ambitious is, more ambitious is certainly good. But a lot of the value added will come from learning from each other rather than any one of us necessarily needing more impetus to push growth.
Do we need the G20 to agree to global growth objectives? Is that tangible enough?
I think it's good to be ambitious. I think it's good to be ambitious on growth, and to the extent that we can put out credible numbers that we're trying to go towards, it's a good thing. But I think that in terms of cranking up efforts in different countries, countries are working as hard as they can. So really the value added to my mind will come from learning from each other in these conversations. And if we can help each other, if we can learn from each other, and perhaps also set up institutions that can help this process, I think that would be one set. And the other set is, let's deal with frictions, so that that can also, by smoothing the frictions, we can move forward.
The IMF has essentially said that more monetary policy tightening is required in India, essentially that inflation is going to remain higher than what your current forecasts are, and in fact growth is going to be lower than what your current forecasts are. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I think there's always a reasonable degree of disagreement between countries and the IMF. I think we're doing what we need to, and we are undertaking a number of reforms. The IMF, understandably, having been on that side myself, is always going to say do more. And clearly there are places we could do more if we had the political consensus and the political certainty that we don't have right now. We have elections coming. But post-election, hopefully, on some of the areas where we need to make changes, we will move forward. For example, there's a goods and services tax, which is in many ways a no-brainer, going to increase the tax revenues, spread the tax net, is going to be a more efficient tax. All the parties agreed, but we couldn't do it before the elections. So post-elections, hopefully that will happen. If the IMF says you should have done that, well, yes, but the politics didn't allow. Going forward, we hope to do it. So, it's good to have an organization from outside that pushes you, but we feel that on many issues, what we're doing is reasonable and we're moving forward.
Talking about politics, I wanted to get to the difference of opinion, which seems to be a very clear difference of opinion between the RBI and the government. If you look at some of the commentary from the Finance Minister, who actually said that the central bank policy should be subservient to the overall economic vision of the government.
Well, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that the overall objective of the central bank, what kind of inflation target to have, should be something that's set by the elected representatives of the people and should not be something the central bank decides on its own. And we've certainly stayed away from setting our own inflation target. That's a process of discussion which the finance minister and the RBI governor, as well as perhaps even Parliament, might have going forward. So we're not there yet. We have a committee which has suggested a target, which is also, by the way, consistent. The process that committee suggests is consistent with the process the Finance Ministry's committee has suggested. So there is no disagreement about the broader need to get a framework in place. I think in terms of how I see the process, and is really that the government sets the objective and the central bank delivers on that objective. Now, in India, we've always had discussions between the finance ministry, between the prime minister and the central bank governor, and the government is not, it's not as if the government is not on a different page on what we've been doing on inflation thus far. So, they may have different views on what they would like to see done, but there's a process, there's a conversation, and it's not that what we're doing ultimately is saying where they say over my dead body and we go ahead and do it. No, I think there is a fair amount of coordination at the highest level.
How would the landscape, the economic landscape in India change if in fact the government does change?
I hope the level of discussion, coordination will continue. It has always been that way in the past, so I don't see a reason why it should not, and I believe it will.
It certainly does appear, though, that if a new government is in fact put in place, a particular government is more pro-business.
It depends. It depends on which government comes in. Even within the Congress, the new government, if a new UPA comes in, could be quite different from the current government with a generational change. So I think that the jury is out on how it will change. My hope is, my sense is, if there is a stable coalition in power post-elections, no matter which persuasion it is, broad policies will continue. There may be a difference in details, but they're all for passing the goods and services tax. They're all for a number of actions which the current government is taking.
I just wanted to briefly touch on your five-pillar policy. Clearly banking reform is one of your key areas of interest. Are you concerned about the increase that we've seen in NPAs?
Non-performing assets are going up. We need to bring them down. We have a framework in place starting April 1st to give the banks more incentive to restructure the asset, to give the entrepreneur more incentive to restructure the asset and move on. I think the lesson of every crisis in the past has been clean up. Before we get to a crisis, I want us to clean up. Let us clean up and make sure we don't get anywhere near the deep problems that other countries have had. Now, there are two things going for us here, which I have to mention. One, a lot of the problems are in public sector banks. Now, that's a problem, but at the end of it, there isn't an issue of solvency because they're backed by the government. Second, that in the cleanup, many of these are projects that are viable. This is not acres of housing built nowhere. There's a little bit of it, but that's not the predominant. These are power projects which need coal. And now the coal has been delivered or is being delivered, they can start producing. So I think a fair amount of these could turn around as growth picks up, as projects get finished. And so to that extent, the problem is contained.
It's fairly clear to the market at this point that the Fed is going to continue to taper at a measured pace. How are you in India going to manage the impact on your economy?
I think we're relatively well positioned. So I actually welcome a measured pace of tapering. The only thing I have been calling for is that in the communication there should be some sensitivity to conditions in emerging markets. And this is not from our perspective, this is broadly emerging markets, some of whom have been in trouble in the last few months. But I am fully prepared for a tapering that continues at this measured pace. We've built reserves. We are in a much better position as far as the current account deficit goes. So I think the era of easy money has to end at some point. And I would rather that it ends in a stable and a measured fashion. So I think we're perfectly okay with a measured tapering.
Well, how active are you prepared to be when it comes to managing the rupee?
I think the rupee has been very stable. My belief is that we should be focused on getting our fundamentals right, and that's been our focus ever since summer of last year. One of the main aspects of our fundamentals is the inflation rate. If investors have a sense the inflation rate is going to come down, both domestic and international investors, they will be more prepared to take a bet on the rupee. And that's essentially what we're focused on.